This is Gwalia War Cemetery in the southwest corner of Belgium. Here lie 467 soldiers killed fighting for Britain and its empire in the First World War. In looking back 100 years to the outbreak of World War I can think of few better places from which to begin to look back at why war came to Europe and the world in 1914. There are men buried here from all parts of Britain, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the West Indies, and Chinese labourers hired by the British military. This is one of scores of war cemeteries lying within a few short miles of the Belgian town of Ypres. In the autumn of 1914, the British Army had just managed to hold Ypres in the face of a German advance. For the next 4 years, the Ypres salient was at the centre of a war which saw millions die. British forces held a trench line just a few miles east of here. Just yards away were the German lines. Both sides lived under constant bombardment. For the most part, the Germans remained on the defensive, forcing the British to launch a series of attacks which foundered on the barbed wire, machine guns and well-prepared defences of the Germans.
This is the grave of my great-uncle, Robert Sterling Banbury. He was killed near here on the 23rd of July 1917. I don't know how he was killed, but clearly some others were on that day. Maybe it was by an artillery shell, maybe they were a patrol, maybe they died from wounds from a previous battle. I shall never know. 2 years before, in 1915, Robert and his two brothers, including my grandfather, volunteered to serve in the Royal Scots. Why they volunteered, I shall never know. They were miners from a fairly grim village in central Scotland. Maybe the hope of military adventure brought them here. Whatever, this is where Robert lies, dead at the age of 21. Within a few square miles of Gwalia Cemetery, hundreds of thousands of people gave their lives between 1914 and 1918.
Between 1914 and 1918, deaths totaled 16 million, and the number of wounded was a further 20 million. Nothing had been seen like it in human history, and hopefully nothing will. In Ypres itself, each evening as the sun goes down, there is a solemn ceremony at the town's Menin Gate, inscribed with the name of 90,000 men who died here, but whose remains were never found. This summer we marked the centenary of the outbreak of the Great War, as it came to be called. In this series, we'll be looking at why it happened, the course of the war, its impact on the Middle East and its outcome. We shall also look at the role of Muslim soldiers who fought for Britain as part of the Indian Army and how they've been commemorated by the country they gave their lives for. But let us start by asking why young Robert Banbury found himself here in Belgium. What brought the world to war in 1914? It's a long way from the killing grounds of the Ypres salient to the dreaming spires of Cambridge University. But we've travelled here to talk to Dr. Alexander Nevis of Cambridge University, who has written extensively on the subject about why the world went to war in 1914. Alex, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the detonator for war, but the reasons behind the war went far beyond that one incident.
Yeah, of course there was. I mean, what we have to keep in mind and always keep in context is that this was the age of imperialism. These weren't nation states, these were empire, imperial states. And there was a lot of simmering tensions over colonial conflicts, inter-imperial rivalries, all leading up to the era in the first few decades before the First World. So while the assassination was, of course, the trigger, the event that pushed them to the outbreak of war, there was a whole, cascading line of conflicts between the great powers in the lead-up.
How did Britain respond to the rise of Imperial Germany?
Well, In the first instance, I mean, of course, there was an arms race going on at the time, and there was more naval investments in naval armaments and things of that nature, and also just a kind of a bit more of an aggressive foreign policy towards Germany, and also the making of alliances, of course, with France, as we know, and then with Russia and France as well. So there was both with what we would call external balancing, with alliance making in the international relations jargon, and internal balancing by more money spent on armaments and everything. They also had a number of war plans in place, which they ended up using to kind of starve the population of Germany if the possibility of war did arise. So there's a very good book by Abner Offer on that, about the kind of the agrarian origins there of the First World War.
And that was a naval blockade of Germany?
Yes, a naval blockade of Germany.
Across Europe, the liberal order was not in a good state. Liberal governments and autocratic governments were facing real challenges in 1914. Were they not?
No, interestingly enough, I mean, almost every country that was involved in the First World War that ended up going to war immediately, at least, was in the midst of some sort of crisis at the time. I mean, in Germany, you had the rise of the Social Democrats, which were seen as a major threat in kind of near hysterical terms by the ruling classes. They were seen as a threat to the internal order. In France, also, they had labor unrest, a lot of labor unrest, in fact, unrest in the colonies in the immediate period before, of course, with the Second Moroccan crisis in 1911. So I mean, all the orders were kind of, they were, I don't want to say they were disintegrating, but they were certainly on the precipice of crisis.
Was that true in Britain too?
Yes, with the Irish and the Irish problem there and everything, and also domestic. There was some domestic unrest there as well in Britain. And Arno Mayer, in fact, roots the kind of general crisis leading to the First World War, and looking at all these kind of domestic crises in each of the states, in France, and Britain, and Russia, in Germany, and Austria-Hungary as well.
Was war an escape for ruling classes in Europe who are under threat from the lower orders?
Well, I think, as far as in the case, and again, this is not to play this game of kind of war blame, because I think that the whole kind of categories of aggressive and offensive and defensive wars is really, I mean, they may have some sort of kind of political purchase, but they have absolutely no analytical validity. But as far as what the documents show, I don't think we can see most of the countries kind of escaping into war for domestic reasons, besides possibly Germany and Austria. Austrian policymakers obviously saw that they couldn't afford another kind of foreign policy setback to the domestic order. They had all these minorities problems. They had internal unrest, great internal unrest. They just couldn't allow for another foreign policy disaster. So they did kind of see this as a kind of escape into war. And to a certain extent, Germany was looking at internal enemies like the Social Democrats, and external enemies, what they saw as Russia. So they did kind of go to, this was the opportunity to go to war, to launch what they called the preventative war against the emergence of Russia as a great power.
Great Britain was still the world power in 1914, but it was increasingly under challenge, in particular from the rise of Germany. How did it respond?
Yeah, what we have to remember is for Britain, the traditional policy of the time was the balance of power, that they were going to maintain equitable distribution of power on the continent of Europe. Not one power was going to be able to dominate. So once Germany kind of launched on this Weltpolitik, this world policy from 1897 onwards, Britain wanted to make sure that they kept them in line. Okay, they didn't challenge them on the seas against their empire, they didn't challenge their colonies, and also that they didn't challenge the international order, the European order. So that then ended up getting them into alliances with France and Russia.
And can we describe World War I as a war between autocratic states on the one hand and democracies on the other?
Yeah, hardly a democracy. I mean, one of the most kind of autocratic regimes in all of Europe, in fact. So I think it's very difficult, if not completely implausible, to say that this was a war of democracies against autocracies. I mean, even after the February Revolution in 1917 in Russia and the United States coming into entering the First World War, I mean, you had Woodrow Wilson calling this as kind of the war to end all wars. This is, the war to make the world safe for democracy. I mean, this is really nonsense. I mean, this is ideological obfuscation.
How did the United States view the war in Europe?
Well, I think they did view it, I mean, well, in 1914, I think the general prevailing view was that we didn't want anything to do with it. Of course, we had neutrality laws, which were in many ways continually violated, with sending armaments or finances to the Allied powers. But I think in general, the consensus, at least in 1914, is the United States wanted to stay out. There was a strong isolationist sentiment, at least geopolitically speaking.
But that changed in the course of the war.
Yes, that changed in the course of the war. I mean, and of course, the sinking of the Lusitania had a lot to do with that. There a lot of propaganda from the Wilson administration obviously had a lot to do with that as well. I mean, it came to be seen that that this wasn't a kind of, I mean, it did come to be seen in the kind of stark terms of democracy versus autocracy. And again, I think that was a propaganda victory for the administration more than anything else.
Was war inevitable in 1914? What drove Britain and the other states to declare war? To discuss that, we've brought together two military historians to debate the issues. Neil Faulkner is editor of Military History Monthly and one of the organisers of No Glory, which opposes any glorification of war in this centenary year. And Nigel Jones is author of Peace and War, Britain in 1914, and War Walk, A Journey Along the Western Front. Before we enter into the debate, I would just like to take on the characters of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, and Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to explain the decision of each state to go to war in the summer of 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm.
Germany went to war in 1914 because Germany was losing the arms race and was being surrounded by a hostile alliance. The French had formed an alliance with the Russians. The British had then joined that alliance, which meant that Germany was surrounded. The Russian army was modernizing. The French army was increasing in size. The British had won the naval arms race, and Germany faced the possibility of national extinction if she didn't fight sooner rather than later when the odds were better.
Kaiser Wilhelm, thank you. Herbert Asquith.
I don't think that Germany had any real reason to feel frightened, because it was traditionally Germany which had taken the aggressive stance as recently as 1870, when it had fought a devastating war against France and then proclaimed the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. Britain certainly was not in any position really to fight a war. It had a tiny professional army. It relied on its navy to keep its worldwide empire intact. So Britain would certainly have not joined in any aggressive moves against Germany, even if France and Russia had undertaken it. But France was terrified of Germany, did not want a war, had built a series of forts and fortifications across its border to defend itself from Germany. So German fears of being surrounded and menaced by an aggressive circle of hostile powers were totally misplaced. I think that Germany, under its aggressive and bombastic, my colleague playing the part, Kaiser Wilhelm, was actually the main danger in the European playground.
But let's just return, gentlemen. First, there had been a build-up of quite severe international tension before 1914. I mean, the assassination in Sarajevo was the ignition of what ignited the war, but they've been tense for many a year.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, this is a dysfunctional geopolitical system, it seems to me, a dysfunctional system of competing nation states. And you have a situation where the first industrial power had built the greatest empire during the 19th century, during the 18th and the 19th century. France had also created a very large empire by the end of the 19th century. Germany was essentially a Central European power, and I think found itself, as its economy grew at a fantastic rate, constrained in terms of raw materials, constrained in terms of markets, constrained in terms of opportunities to invest capital abroad. So this was the kind of Johnny-come-lately state that needed to expand at the expense of established empires. And what that did, unquestionably, was to lead to rising tension inside Europe, increasing arms expenditure, the formation of hostile alliances that then explodes into war in 1914.
Nigel, Neil suggested Germany is almost a victim here.
No, I think there was a contradiction in what he said at the beginning of his role as Kaiser, when he was saying we feel menaced, and what he's just said when he admits that Germany was actually looking to expand and was rather jealous that it didn't have the same empire as Britain and France had. So in his first statement he said that Germany was defensive and worried about aggression, and in the other he more or less admitted that Germany was potentially an aggressive power. And I think that aggression actually did happen, and it came about in 1914. You're right. There have been a lot of near misses in the first 14 years of the 20th century that had nearly led to war. In 1914, we finally slid over the edge.
But sure, the assassination of the Austrian heir in Sarajevo, there had already been a lot of tension inside the Balkans. There have been 2 wars in the Balkans which have been limited to the Balkans. Either war could have been avoided, or at least it could be contained into a regional war. A nasty war, admittedly, but a regional war in the Balkans, no?
Documents that were discovered by a German historian, funnily enough, in 1961 called Fritz Fischer, prove conclusively, in my view and in the view of the overwhelming majority of First World War historians, that Germany used the opportunity afforded by the assassination in Sarajevo to deal a blow with its main 2 opponents, as it saw them, France and Russia. And they used Austria as the excuse for that war, and they encouraged Austria to go to war with Germany's full backing in revenge for the assassination at Sarajevo. So although I'd agree with Neil that there was a build-up, a potentially dangerous build-up of 2 rival power blocks, that's beyond question, I think that Germany and Austria were the principal guilty parties.
So Nigel is putting the blame on Germany and Austria. Do you buy into that, Neil?
Well, I take a slightly different starting point because, of course, I'm not actually Kaiser Bill. And in putting the argument, what I was actually doing was reflecting the position of the German ruling class, the German elite, and we're talking about a class of bankers, industrialists, arms manufacturers, generals, the German social elite. That was their position. And to a degree, that was their perception, that they were developing later than the other powers, and their ability to develop their economy further and to develop their national power was constrained by the established empires. But my own perspective is quite a different one. It is to say there's a competition going on in Europe between rival elites in control of different growing capitalist economies and growing empires, but that doesn't translate into it being in the interests of ordinary Germans, ordinary Austrians, ordinary French, ordinary Russians, ordinary British people to get involved in a conflict which is fundamentally about deciding how you're going to divide up the world in the interests of one group of competing bankers and industrialists or another. For that to turn into a carnage which kills 15, 16 million people, it seems to me is proof that we have a world gone mad, a geopolitical system which is so dysfunctional, it ought to have been got rid of.
Well, Germany went to war. It attacked into France and Belgium, but once it arrived at the English Channel, Britain was not going to tolerate having the German presence on the English Channel coast, was it?
Absolutely. A British traditional foreign policy was that no hostile power should control the Channel ports, and with them the sea lanes on which Britain depended not only to maintain its grip on its empire, but also to maintain simple import of foodstuff to feed its population. So Britain was not going to tolerate that, obviously. But the actual casus belli, the actual reason that Britain went into the war, and we can establish this by looking at the letters and diaries of the cabinet ministers who took that decision, was outrage at the fact that Germany had torn up its guarantee of Belgian neutrality and had bypassed the French fortifications and invaded Belgium to get into France under the notorious Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who thought it up originally. And that accompanied by massacres, wanton massacres of Belgian civilians, different in scale but not in spirit from what the Nazis did 20 years later, that caused total outrage in Britain. Originally there was a cabinet revolt against the idea of going into war. We shouldn't go into war. We haven't been involved in the European war for a century. But the revolt collapsed as soon as the reports came in of what the Germans were doing in Belgium.
This was poor little Belgium, was it, Neil? I mean, do you buy into that?
Yeah, well, you see, I don't accept that great powers go to war in the interests of small countries, in the interests of oppressed people, in the interests of human rights and democracy. I mean, the world just does not work like that. The reality is that the British ruling class, the British elite, decided to go to war because it was in the interests of the British Empire to do so. Now, I think the first thing you said, Nigel, was absolutely spot on. They went to war, unquestionably, because Germany was moving through Belgium. There was a threat to the Channel ports. That has always been a reason throughout British history why the British go to war. They went to war for that reason in 1588 at the time of the Armada. It was the same in relation to Napoleon, 1805. It's the same in the First World War and then again in the Second World War.
There were atrocities in Belgium, were there not?
There were indeed atrocities, and the atrocities were very unpleasant, and the atrocities were a reflection of the character, I think, of German society, which was described, I mean, Trotsky, the revolutionary, described Germany at the time as being a feudal turret on a capitalist base. You had this Prussian military aristocracy that was now industrializing. It now had industrial power behind it, which is why Germany had become so powerful. But the atrocities were real, and they were a reflection of a barbarism and an inhumanity. But that said, if you look at what the British and the French empires are doing in their colonies, you can find parallels for everything that the Germans did in Europe.
Nigel, I mean, we look back through the prism of history, and of course we're shrouded by what happened in the Second World War and what we know happened then. But you know, the suggestion, Neil was making a comparison, almost I suggest, between Prussian violence in 1914 and what happened later on. Is there a comparison?
I'm afraid I would go along with what Neil has said, and that Trotsky quote was unfamiliar to me, but I think it is a very accurate description of what German-Prussian society was like at that time.
The assassination of the heir to the Austrian Empire, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, set in motion the events building up to a European-wide conflagration, which would in turn become a global war. Austria was allied to Germany. Facing them was an alliance of France, Russia and Britain. Once war began, the various allied states would be quickly drawn into the conflict. Austria blamed the Balkan state of Serbia for the killing, and, egged on by its ally Germany, declared war. Serbia was allied to Russia, and when that began mobilising its army, Germany and Austria declared war. Germany demanded Russia's ally, France, stay neutral, but she refused, and she joined in the side of Russia. Finally, when Germany invaded Belgium, en route to attacking northern France, Britain declared war. Over the next 4 years, countries in every continent would join the fray. In 1901, a new member of the British House of Commons, Winston Churchill, warned that while ministers and MPs spoke lightly of the prospects of a European war, any such conflict would end in the ruin of the vanquished and the scarcely less fatal commercial dislocation and exhaustion of the conquerors. In May 1914, the President of the United States sent an emissary to the various European capitals. He reported back, "The situation is extraordinary. It is militarism run stark mad. Unless someone acting for you can bring about a different understanding, there is some day to be an awful cataclysm. No one in Europe can do it. There is too much hatred, too many jealousies. Whenever England consents, France and Russia will close in on Germany and Austria. England does not want Germany wholly crushed, for she would then have to reckon alone with her ancient enemy Russia. But if Germany insists upon an ever-increasing navy, then England will have no choice." Such warnings went unheard in the summer of 1914, as Europe marched to war. Crowds gathered in Berlin, London and Paris to greet the outbreak of war, and there were scenes of celebration as the first troops marched off to war. The governments of the various belligerent states believed that the war would be short and victorious. An exception was a new British War Minister, Lord Kitchener, who warned the cabinet that the war would last at least 3 years and require the mobilisation of millions. Modern industry had created the means with which to carry out mass slaughter: the machine gun, barbed wire, rapid-firing artillery, warplanes and poison gas. In the summer of 1914, young men flocked to the colours with dreams of military glory. Those dreams would perish amidst the trenches in the mud and on the barbed wire in the months and years to come. The world would witness a slaughter it could scarcely imagine. 4 of the empires that would find themselves at war by the close of 1914, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia and the Ottoman Empire, would be brought down by the time the guns ceased firing in November 1918. In the next episode of The War to End Wars, we will examine how the war was fought and the sheer scale of death and destruction brought down on the world.